So isn't it just a fact that nationalism is bad and dangerous? Well, the answer to that is ends. Nationalism has been deliberately misdefined over the decades, especially since World War II. Things blamed on nationalism often have other sources, as no nation really has a pure ideology, but generally a hyphenated one. For example, uh, it's generally the idea of most people in the political sphere to pretend the word socialism doesn't exist when it's paired with national socialism. Or you can just ignore it and pretend it's like not really there. Yet there it is. A hyphenated style of system or a hyphenated style of government combining something akin to nationalism. Modern nationalism is generally considered to have been born out of the French Revolution, although an English variation did precede it. While the French were struggling to put their republic together, essentially every European state declared war and marched on France. At the time, nations of Europe depended on relatively small professional armies to do the bulk of the works of war. A great deal of France's officers' corps had fled, and many more would be forced to flee as the revolution unraveled. France's army was barely up to the task of fighting one major nation. With all of Europe marching on them, the Republic had reached literally existential crisis. France had distinct ethnic regions that had always felt separate from Parisian France. The Republican government used the crisis to rally the nation to go to the defense of France. The regions of France were all embraced as Frenchmen as opposed to their provincial homes. This led to mass conscription, where everybody who could fight and had the fire in their belly picked up arms in a hastily put together units to stop the professional armies of Europe, with essentially a wall of motivated and enthusiastic people. The numbers of the French army rose so quickly that France was actually incapable of producing the firearms to equip them. Many, possibly most, went to the front line with pikes rather than firearms. They did ultimately succeed in saving the Republic. Now, when the French Revolution disintegrated into madness and began executing people, implementing mandatory searches of domiciles, and seizing the private arms, clearly this was not a manifestation of French nationalism. People weren't being murdered by the Paris Commune for failing to be French. It was due to failing to meet the rapidly changing revolutionary standards. These weren't even attempts to safeguard the Republic, as the Commune was often at complete odds with those who were in the process of drafting the new Constitution of the Republic. The Commune executed people whose sole crime was being an enemy of their rapidly evolving ideology. It conducted warrantless, nonstop searches of people's homes in a paranoid search for enemies and evidence. The Commune's ideology was not a Republican or a nationalist one, but one of an ever continuing revolution. In short, proto communists. So, didn't nationalism cause Napoleon to go empire building across Europe? It's absolutely for sure that French nationalism helped him. However, putting the blame for his military endeavors on nationalism is a stretch. The world declared war on him first, and then the British refused any form of negotiated settlement. When he defeated foes, he rarely occupied them for long. He set rulers in place that were less likely to go to war with him. Most places the French army went through were allowed to go through their own nationalistic self determination. He implemented reforms in the liberated countries that were far more liberal than had been there before the French got there. A large portion of Napoleon's army was made up of soldiers from satellite states. So, surely World War I was a disaster brought from nationalism. There's a misconception about how much war occurred in Europe between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and World War I. War was almost continuing or occurring continuously, not everywhere at once like World War I. Anglo-centric historians distort the era as peaceful because nothing happened that required British intervention into Europe. The nation-states alliance system is, I feel, erroneously cited as a major cause. It certainly did make that war wider and more destructive. However, there was no big period of peace preceding this. Lack of alliances would have led to countries that it would have been easier to defeat in war. Thus, the alliances forced the great powers into a tense stand down, actually delaying the onset of the war. The first problem came from the Ottoman Empire. It was a multi ethnic empire that was not nationalist. The Young Turks attempted to create a nationalist sentiment, but the best they could do was a lightweight Turkic ethnic tribalism, which, although created a bit of improvement around the Bosphorus region, it caused deterioration all over the rest of the empire. This was counter nationalist, as all the other groups are left out. A lack of Ottoman nationalism caused the Balkans to revolt and win independence. This created vast destabilization. Now, compare the French during their revolution to the Balkans. True nationalism is designed to bring ethnic groups together in unity. This is what the revolutionary French nationalism did. What happened in the Balkans is essentially tribalism, which creates a non-stop case for war as long as one member of your ethnic group is outside your boundaries. So let's take a quick look at Austria-Hungary, major power in World War I. Essentially, it was a country with two major subdivisions, Austrians and Hungarians, and their languages and cultures actually have very little resemblance to each other. In fact, Hungarian is so strange and distinct, at least the last time I checked, they couldn't even trace it back to its point of origin, whereas most of the other languages in Europe they can. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had 12 distinct languages that needed to be taken into consideration to command their army. There were additional 20 or so languages of minorities who were resistant to assimilation. And yes, Austria-Hungary was a nationalist enterprise. So, what ultimately caused World War I were tribalists attempting to thwart nationalist stabilization. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was not a target of opportunity. He was deliberately killed by Serbian tribalists. Austria-Hungary was a dual monarchy. Each country had their own king and their own parliament. This arrangement was made to allow two distinct nations to function as a single entity. It was far greater than a confederation, but not quite a union. The Archduke favored a triple monarchy, which added a Slavic king. The goal was to thwart the tribal impulses by giving the Slavs a greater say in their own government. The Serbs who assassinated the Archduke wanted to trigger a crisis so that they could set up future events to be able to annex the Serbian portion of Austria-Hungary. The future crisis probably came a lot faster than they anticipated. So, what about the bad boys of World War II? Clearly, that was nationalism at its worst. Or was it? First, Italy. Were they nationalist? Absolutely. Did nationalism drive their conquests? No. Italy's brand of socialism, and fascism is a form of socialism, called for a harkening back to colonialism. Fascism had adopted Marxist socialist thinking in terms of the shrinking market theory as an imperative. The idea was that, or the shrinking market theory, I know Marx talked about it, but I don't know if he actually created the idea. However, the idea of shrinking market theory meant that a country needed to acquire non-industrialized regions with raw materials to create a viable economy. Otherwise, the economy would collapse. The idea of recreating the Roman Empire didn't really become verbalized by Mussolini until well into the fight with France. Now, Germany's brand of socialism also suffered from the shrinking market theory compulsion. Instead of colonialism, they believed conquest was the only fix. They wanted two resources they didn't have: food and oil. Germany's other mania could not realistically be called nationalism. It was tribalism on steroids. By the way, this is the birth of DEI racial hierarchy. The Frankfurt School copied the Nazis. In Germany, people who had spent generations in that country could be excommunicated by bloodline, and people who were in another country altogether with no blood, culture, or language linkage could be declared German adjacent based on a flowchart. Ultimately, the German system was a system of uniting their tribe, and you could be their friend as long as you weren't members of the tribe, if you get my drift. The impetus for this hierarchy comes from a reinterpretation of Marx. Marx saw conflict between the classes as the issue preventing socialism. National Socialists decided that conflict between the races is what prevented their form of socialism from working. Thus, the conflict needed to be ended by any means possible. So up until this point, I'm deflecting on the idea that nationalism has been the boogeyman. We looked at Republican France before the revolution went crazy. They used nationalism for homeland defense. We noted Austria-Hungary using and trying to expand nationalism to stabilize a highly unstable region. And it's my position that it was tribalism that started both World War I and II. So if nationalism isn't necessarily the root of all evils, can it be a force for good? Well, the answer is yes. And we see this in the form of liberal nationalism, which we first observed really in Britain in the form of the United Kingdom, which was ultimately copied by the US. What is liberal nationalism? It's when a country displays the characteristics of nationalism, yet at the same time strives to either protect or expand the rights or liberties of their citizens. So within the liberal nationalist context, how does nationalist component play out? I believe it's a function that the ruling class considers themselves to be the same people as everybody else in the country. Either via duty or enlightened self-interest, they recognize the value of improving the lives of their fellow citizens. Now, that doesn't infer a loss of class consciousness. They may put themselves or the people they associate with ahead of the general populace, but there's no other entity or people that get preferential treatment over their own population. In other words, the ruling class may believe they're better than the working class, but they still believe the working class is part of them. So at the time of American independence, an Englishman was the most free person on earth. British nationalism unified the kingdoms of England, Scotland, Wales, and North Ireland. They enjoyed unprecedented rights and wealth compared to the rest of the world. Because of mercantilism, the English believed that the only route to greatness was by creating a home industrial market fed by raw materials from abroad. Mercantilism drove them to alternately occupy areas to secure natural resources or ports to basically control the shipping lanes for those same resources. So liberal nationalism protected the rights of British citizens. Mercantilism drove the exploitation of distant foreign peoples. Now, you might, if you're quick on the ball, you might notice that there's a striking similarity to mercantilism and the shrinking market theory, the idea that the homeland must be the producer and you must have distant lands providing raw materials to make that homeland work. Um, Not sure if Marx borrowed from that idea or not, but that's interesting. So, although British America also enjoyed unprecedented rights, British mercantilism made British Americans second class citizens. The British economic system stifled American economic growth, favoring raw material output over building industrial infrastructure. This contributed greatly to the independence movement. The United States was also a seat of liberal nationalism. Because we are so distant from the period, most people fail to understand just how ununited and uniquely different each state was. American nationalism brought together these very different entities under one house. The idea of the rights of Englishmen continued under American liberal nationalism. In many ways, our rights are broader and better protected than theirs were. Socialism has varieties such as democratic, national, and Marxist. Capitalism has varieties such as anarcho, free market, and crony. So too does nationalism have its own flavors. Tribalism, which could be restated as ethno-nationalism, is bad. National socialism is bad. Liberal nationalism has been one of the greater goods of the Western liberal era. All right. So in the comment section below, tell me what you think on those thoughts. I know some of them are out there from what you're thinking, but what else describes how we are at where we're at? And mind you, we have shifted away from our national liberal or liberal nationalist roots when we started adopting the ideas of globalism. And I think that's part of what I was trying to get at when I was talking about the idea of how in the liberal nationalist system, the establishment looks at its people as part of the whole. So therefore, it's to their benefit to improve the lot of the whole. Once the establishment becomes globalist, they start putting other peoples and other entities in front of their own people and thinking that these entities and other peoples are equal or better to the ultimate plan. So again, comment below. What do you think? And do think. Don't just like knee jerk at the terminology. Think about how it actually plays out. If the YouTube algorithm has brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, check out my other content. You probably want to subscribe. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.